Around 1550 BCE, Kemet rose from the fractures of the Second Intermediate Period and entered the Age of Empire. This was the 18th dynasty, the beginning of the New Kingdom, and one of the most powerful eras in ancient history. The Rhind mathematical papyrus preserves one of the oldest known collections of advanced mathematics in human history, written by the scribe Ahmose from earlier sources. It demonstrates that ancient Kemetic scholars had already developed sophisticated methods for arithmetic, geometry, fractions, surveying, and engineering thousands of years ago. And the Westcar papyrus, which preserves traditional Egyptian folktales. Under Ahmose I, Egypt did not simply reunify, it transformed. A professional standing army emerged, complete with elite chariot divisions and a powerful combat navy, projecting Kemetic power from Nubia in the south toward the Euphrates in the north. Monumental construction resumed, trade routes were restored, temples were enriched, and after generations of division and foreign occupation, Kemet once again rose as a dominant imperial power of the ancient world. And yet, from the shadow of this same empire, another story would later emerge, a story remembered not through temple walls or royal inscriptions, but through oral tradition, scripture, and faith. A story that has echoed across millennia. A story of a people leaving Egypt, fleeing oppression, crossing into Sinai and beyond, and a man named Moses standing at the threshold between bondage and deliverance. It is among the most enduring narratives ever preserved in human consciousness. Historians and researchers have long questioned whether fragments of cultural memory surrounding the Hyksos expulsion may have echoed forward into later Exodus traditions, not because the Hyksos were Israelites in the biblical sense, but because both narratives speak of Semitic populations connected to the Delta, speak of conflict with Egyptian authority and departure from Egypt. According to the biblical narrative, Moses returned to Egypt carrying a message he claimed came directly from his God, demanding that Pharaoh release the Israelites from bondage. But Pharaoh refused, rejecting both Moses and the warning that followed, setting the stage for one of the most dramatic and controversial narratives in biblical tradition. Egyptian chariots and soldiers pursue the Israelites toward the waters as the fleeing population stood trapped between the army and the sea. It is said through the biblical narrative that the waters parted, opening a path for Moses to lead his people to cross. A moment that would become one of the most enduring and symbolic stories in religious history. After Pharaoh refused to release the Israelites, rivers turned to blood. Darkness covered the land. Disease spread through livestock and crops. And finally, the firstborn sons of Egypt were said to perish in a single night. But when we examine the historical and archaeological record, the story becomes far less certain. There is no confirmed Egyptian account describing these catastrophic events, no evidence of a nationwide collapse caused by plagues, and no clear archaeological proof of a massive Israelite population enslaved in Egypt at the scale described in the biblical text. What later generations would interpret as a curse upon Egypt appears more accurately within the text itself as divine judgment against Pharaoh and the Egyptian state. Moses is not portrayed as a sorcerer casting spells upon a people, but as a messenger carrying out the will of his deity against a kingdom refusing obedience. The narrative ultimately functions less as documented history and more as theological symbolism, a story of liberation, divine power, and national identity formation. And over centuries, this tale became foundational to later traditions surrounding Passover, salvation, and eventually even themes echoed within Christianity itself. Like Easter, Moses became more than a leader of departure. He became lawgiver, mediator, the bridge between the people and their God. And in the wilderness of Sinai, the tradition reaches one of its most symbolic moments. For 40 days and 40 nights, Moses ascended the sacred mountain, vanishing into cloud, thunder, fire, and divine presence. Below, the people waited. Days passed, then weeks, and uncertainty began to spread through the camp. The man who had led them out of Egypt, the prophet who had spoken against Pharaoh, had disappeared into the mountain of God. And in his absence, they turned back toward older traditions familiar to the ancient Egyptians and Canaanites by fashioning a golden calf for worship. Moses was met not by obedience, but by celebration around the idol. But this moment becomes even more striking, because long before the Israelite traditions emerged, bull symbolism already held sacred power throughout Egypt and Canaan alike. The cow and bull were deeply associated with divine fertility, kingship, motherhood, and celestial power through figures such as Hathor, one of the most ancient and beloved deities of Kemet. And in Canaan, the Apis bull was also connected to divine authority. So when Moses descended from the mountain and saw the people gathered before the golden calf, the outrage was not simply about an idol. It was about return. A return to sacred systems, return to symbols of divine power that the new covenant was attempting to leave behind. The tablets were shattered, the camp thrown into chaos, and the struggle revealed something deeper. The Exodus tradition was not only a journey out of Egypt, but a struggle over memory itself. A conflict between the older religious world of the ancient Egyptians and Canaanites, and the emergence of a new identity centered upon one God alone. And Egypt, in the sacred telling, was left behind as judgment fell upon the land. But history asks a different question, because Egypt did not fall. It did not vanish. It did not collapse into silence. Egypt continued through dynasties. Kemet itself continued forward into one of the most sophisticated eras of its civilization. Beyond the Sinai traditions and the desert narratives, the Nile Valley remained alive with monumental ambition, sacred ceremony, scientific administration, and imperial power. This was not a broken kingdom. This was Imperial Egypt, a world of armies, temples, fortresses, scribes, grain, labor, and stone. A civilization still ruling, still recording, still organized. Temples still rose beside the riverbanks. Trade fleets still crossed distant waters. Priests, architects, scribes, and engineers continued shaping one of the ancient world's greatest states. Under the rule of Hatshepsut, Kemet entered an era of extraordinary stability, wealth, and architectural achievement. Rather than defining her reign through endless warfare, Hatshepsut strengthened the empire through administration, trade, monumental construction, and economic expansion. Her mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahari rose against the cliffs of western Thebes as one of the most elegant architectural achievements of the ancient world, while obelisks of massive scale were erected at Karnak to proclaim the strength and continuity of the state. One of the most important events of her reign was the celebrated expedition to the land of Punt, a region deeply connected to Egypt since pre-dynastic times through trade, incense, exotic woods, gold, ivory, and sacred ritual materials. Temple reliefs portray fleets traveling south along the Red Sea to Punt, returning with living myrrh, trees, rare goods, and diplomatic exchanges. These expeditions were not merely commercial. They reinforced Egypt's identity as part of a much older African and Red Sea world that long predated the later empires of the Mediterranean. Under Hatshepsut, Kemet demonstrated that imperial greatness was not built through conquest alone, but through organization, engineering, trade networks, spiritual authority, and control of international exchange. Her reign became one of the clearest examples of Egypt operating at the height of its economic, cultural, and administrative sophistication. Long before the famous story of Solomon and the Queen of Sheba entered written tradition, another royal journey was already carved into stone. During the reign of Hatshepsut in the 15th century BCE, Egypt launched one of the most celebrated diplomatic expeditions of the ancient world. Its destination was Punt, a land connected to Kemet since pre-dynastic times through trade, ritual exchange, incense, gold, ivory, and sacred materials. The reliefs at Deir el-Bahari show something remarkable. Foreign rulers receiving Egyptian envoys, diplomatic exchanges between distant lands, elite delegations carrying valuable gifts, and negotiations conducted between powerful kingdoms connected by the Red Sea. Centuries later, another story would emerge, a story of a great ruler renowned for wisdom, a story of a queen journeying from a distant southern land, arriving with an entourage, luxury goods, precious commodities, and diplomatic purpose. The world would remember this as the story of Solomon and the Queen of Sheba. Whether the two accounts are directly connected remains unknown. Yet the parallels are striking. A royal expedition, a southern kingdom, an exchange of gifts, diplomacy between powerful states, and the movement of wealth, knowledge, and prestige across ancient trade networks. Unlike the later story of Sheba, however, Hatshepsut's expedition is preserved in contemporary reliefs created during the event itself. It survives not as oral tradition, but as history carved into stone. And so the question remains, when later generations told stories of queens traveling across great distances to meet celebrated rulers, were they preserving echoes of older journeys already famous in the ancient world? Long before the rise of Rome, before the empires of Greece, the Red Sea was already a highway of commerce, diplomacy, and cultural exchange. For thousands of years, Egypt maintained connections with the lands to the south and east through maritime trade routes stretching along the African coast and into the Horn of Africa. The expedition of Hatshepsut stands as the clearest surviving record of this relationship. But centuries later, another kingdom would emerge within these same trade networks. Sheba, known in South Arabian inscriptions as Saba, its influence extended across both sides of the Red Sea, linking present-day Yemen with parts of Eritrea and northern Ethiopia through commerce, navigation, and elite exchange. And it is from this older African and Red Sea world, from Punt, Sheba, and the great trading kingdoms of antiquity, that the tradition of the Queen of Sheba ultimately emerges, preserving echoes of journeys, diplomacy, and royal encounters long remembered after the kingdoms themselves had faded. After her, Thutmose III turned expansion into system through conquest. Long before the biblical story of Moses, before the Exodus, before Sinai entered sacred memory, Egypt was already marching into the Levant. Around 1457 BCE, during the reign of Thutmose III, Kemet fought one of the most decisive battles of the ancient world, the Battle of Megiddo. This was not myth, this was empire. A coalition of Canaanite rulers had gathered at Megiddo, a strategic fortress controlling the trade routes of the north. In the reign of Thutmose III, around 1479 to 1425 BCE, Kemet reached one of its great imperial heights. And in year 23 of his reign, at the Battle of Megiddo, Egypt crushed a Canaanite coalition and reasserted control over the Levant. This was not a broken Egypt. This was a disciplined military state. Chariots, officers, scribes, supply lines, and strategy. A kingdom so organized that the campaign was carved into the walls of Karnak in some of the oldest detailed military records in history. And Megiddo mattered. It controlled a strategic pass between Egypt and northern lands, which is why its name would echo for centuries until Megiddo became Armageddon, the symbolic battlefield of the end of days. So if we step back before Ramesses, before Moses, before later biblical memory hardened into sacred narrative, we find something else at Megiddo. Not Egypt collapsing, but Egypt conquering. The evidence for this dynasty is overwhelming. The Valley of the Kings, the Amarna letters, the golden tomb of Tutankhamun, proof of unimaginable wealth, diplomacy, and power.